First of all, Claude, thank you so much for the invitation to kick off the series, and congratulations on your new role. So we're here to talk about Iceland. The one joke I get. But before I jump in, I just wanted to take everyone back to February 2025. Now, I was finishing off the manuscript, and the project was of great discussion at home. I had friends inquiring about how long my break from public service was going to be, and I, responded with unwanted rants about Arctic geopolitical facts I thought everyone should know. My son has told all of his friends that his mum writes on green planets, which was fun. So plenty of people really did find my focus quite odd. And arguably, I might owe Trump money now that Greenland is very popular. Whenever I'm doing these sorts of briefings or talks on Greenland or the Arctic more broadly, I never really get to talk about the Australian strategic interest in the Arctic. So if you'll give me a moment, I'd really like to share that. So first of all, I find the interest in the Arctic for an Australian quite straightforward. We, Australia, are the sole operator of Greenlandic mines. We hold the permits. An Australian listed company does, that is. And they have recently hired Julie Bishop as the public affairs assistants, point of contact there. And they have rebranded themselves in the last 4 to 5 weeks from Greenland Minerals on the ASX to Energy Transition Minerals. Of course, China owns a large stake in this firm. It is one to watch. So further back, we have the Australian explorer Sir Herbert Wilkins. He was the first to take a submarine under the polar ice cap in the Arctic, the first to fly across the Arctic Ocean. He's so revered in global polar exploration that in 1958, U.S Skate, which was the first nuclear-powered submarine to surface at the North Pole, the crew there actually scattered his ashes in a ceremony to mark his centrality to global polar affairs. He's born in South Australia. We should know more about him. Australia is also a signatory to the Svalbard Treaty. So this gives all Australian nationals equal rights to commercial, research, or movement on that Arctic island. Now for actually Greenland. Right, so this is my go-to map for understanding why Greenland. It was published in the Time magazine in 1948. You can see the centrality of both Greenland and Alaska to the US hemispheric strategy right there. This is important because there's nothing new about Trump's Greenland interest. It is very much an established and enduring security interest for Washington and indeed a policy effort. I think it's useful to set aside this indelicate nature of Trump's discourse over Greenland, however funny we might find it, or arguments that his interest is all about resources or stopping China from bedding down. This is a really simple story, and it's one of geography. So Greenland is the world's largest island, home to 57,000 people. It's of immense geostrategic value due to its geography. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, which is consisting of Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. Does anyone want to share if they're from the Danish embassy? No? Yes. Okay, we can have fun. US interest in Greenland is long-standing. It's over 2 centuries old at least, and it is rapidly, obviously, re-emerging in contemporary geopolitics due to a trinity of levers that my work generally looks at, which is intensified great power competition, global resource insecurity, and an opening Arctic. Now, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you all a crash course in Greenlandic history. That is what I shall do. So Greenland was discovered by the Norse Vikings, Eric the Red, in 982 AD. Then we have what was called the Little Ice Age, which hit Greenland in the 14th century. And by the 15th AD, the small Norse settlements, so up to 2,500 people, Vikings, were there. They had vanished. Attention returned to Greenland in 1721 when we had the Norwegian missionary arriving, basically to check in on what was going on. What's really interesting is through the archives in 1408, there was the last kind of word that came from the Viking settlers, the Norse people of Greenland, and that was to celebrate a wedding and a burning of a witch. So we know things were operating, and then we had that gap. All right. A big part of the Greenlandic history that falls to the wayside that does matter is back in the Napoleonic Wars. So in 1814, the Kingdom of Denmark and Norway split, and under the Treaty of Kiel, Denmark gave Norway to Sweden, but it maintained possession of the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. Norway moved quite quickly to secure independence within that Swedish realm arrangement. And at some point, it was in the archives stated that Oslo argued that because it had its independence there in this arrangement, it was not bound by the Treaty of Kiel. And that's something that's used in the 1920s. We'll get to that in a moment. So after the purchase of Alaska in 1867, you had Secretary of State Seward. We call it the Seward Folly because people thought it was crazy that he had come off the back of purchasing Alaska off the Russians, and now he seemed to be looking at a map and sort of picking other islands. So this is what we call, the Seward Folly. He attempted to buy on behalf of Washington, Greenland, and Iceland from Denmark. So I can talk about that later, but when everything kicked off with Trump again recently, I was interested to see whether or not Iceland would also be part of this original gambit. Right, 1931. Norway, Denmark have a huge spat. It basically ends up with Norway annexing what was called Eric the Red Land of Greenland, southeast area. It ended two or so years later after the International Court of Justice ruled that Denmark didn't have to occupy all of Greenland, so the east of Greenland, to claim sovereignty. Norway simply ceded and they got on with things. Of interest to legal scholars in the room is that in 1933, that ruling set a very interesting precedent, which we might see used in Antarctica post-treaty. And again, the archives talk quite interestingly about the potential for a state not needing to have occupation of an entire mass in order to claim sovereignty. World War II saw Nazi Germany eye Greenland for weather stations. Greenland was key to forecasting weather for Eastern Europe. A handful of Nazi soldiers managed to dig in deep in the ice cap and set up stations on the northeast Greenlandic coast. During World War II, Copenhagen fell to Nazi Germany. Community leaders in Greenland worked with the Danish ambassador at the time, who was still posted and safe in Washington, to come up with a deal, basically, to keep Greenland out of Nazi hands. This was known as the U.S. occupation of Greenland. I think it's really interesting that our focus in the discourse looks at the notion that the US simply came in April 1941 and started setting up camps to secure Greenland, because we miss a key date around that time. And that is while the US was setting up all sorts of bases and sort of fortifying Greenland, Iceland held a referendum and exited the Kingdom of Denmark. So a lot of people sometimes throw out in the argument sort of, well, Iceland was also part of the Danish kingdom and they're doing okay because they are out on their own now. And the interesting argument to that is, well, the timing of it all mattered. They didn't have, Greenland doesn't have as much freedom to do so right now. So while negotiations were ongoing in terms of just how the occupation would play out for the US actually stationed off-duty Coast Guard members to defend the world's sole operating cryolite mine in Greenland. And this is a key point of World War II history. So cryolite is like a blobby substance, critical mineral, and it drops the melting point for the smelting process if you're going to make aluminium. So your ability to produce at mass aircraft frames for Allies was something that gave, the Allies an edge for things like the Battle of Britain. This was down to the Greenlandic mines and the fact that they were kept out of Nazi Germany hands. Fast forward to 1949, President Truman offered to buy Denmark for $100 million worth of gold. That was denied and set to the side. And then by the end of World War II, there was no indication that the US planned to exit Greenland, that it planned to pack up and leave. You then had the 1949 Defensive Alliance, NATO, established, and use and access of Greenland became Denmark's major contribution offering to the alliance. In 1951, Denmark and the US negotiated an agreement when it became clear the US had no plans to leave. And this was basically meant to manage Washington's use of and footprint in Greenland. Now, Greenland had become a key enabler of Western security during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And the legal framework, which is all on the internet, of the 1951 Defense Agreement is super interesting because it says there's no endpoint, there's no expiration of this agreement. It will stay in place so long as the parties assess that there is a threat. Doesn't actually stipulate, they went back and forth as lawyers do, what the threat was and who it was posed to. In 1951, the treaty also banned any fraternization or any engagement between US troops and the Inuit communities. They weren't even allowed to, talk, engage, nothing, kept very separate. So Denmark controlled international access to Greenland entirely. You couldn't go there. It was dubbed a colony until 1953. It changed from colony in 1953 to county, but there was no consultation with the Greenlandic people. And Copenhagen, in the archival work I've done, it was quite clear that it was a knee-jerk reaction to shift the status because you started having international agreements come online, like the United Nations Charter, which was not very supportive of people who were still colonizing. So I'm still on this one. It's all good. So Greenland secured home rule in 1979. What home rule was basically simple control over really limited governance activities. So things like policing a city or planning what books were put together for children's education, those sorts of things. A little bit more control came in 1991. Greenlandic people were given the primary health care, their ability to look after their own primary health care. Incidentally, that's the year that the Danish coil controversy hit the headlines. If any of you are aware of what the coil controversy was? No? Okay, so it's forced contraceptive devices were placed inside Inuit girls as young as 10. It was a Danish policy between 1960 and 1990. Parents were not told, nor were the girls. No one knew what they were for. The birth rate of Greenland halved during this period, which according to the extant policy of the time was the point, to limit the population that the Danish people had to pay for. Reparations were paid to these women, those that are still alive, and Google will help you find the formal report that came out from the commission, the Danish commission into this last year. Just awful. 2004, let's jump ahead. The US and Denmark renegotiated the 1951 Defense Agreement. This is something that we're missing from the discourse at the moment. If you hear people say, well, Trump already has the ability right now to put 600 bases on Greenland, what does he need to throw it all away for? Well, no, he doesn't. In 2004, that agreement was actually revised. Greenlandic agency was introduced into the issue of defence of the island, and the ability for Washington to freely grow or establish military bases was heavily restricted. They are only allowed one area, which was the Thule Air Base, now the Bidufik Space Base. Starts with P, but it's Bidufik. Self-governance for Greenland was secured in 2009. The limited governance activities list that they were given was very slightly expanded. From 2009, Greenlandic became the formal language, not Danish. And a pathway was established in the Danish constitution for Greenland to gain full independence from Denmark. Denmark still controls foreign and defence aspects of Greenland, including the provision of large welfare service grants, which we call the block grant. And the Greenlandic independence economically on Denmark remains very high. President Trump first raised the idea of buying Greenland in 2019. It was followed by revived discussions, which I think you're all here for now, in really early days this year, but also it kind of bubbled to the surface in early 2024 when he sent his son and 5 or 6 close investment friends to start scoping for what exactly they would purchase, which is happening right now. Okay, so briefly to outline, this is my last slide, don't worry. Briefly to outline the contemporary strategic issues that I think are worth following when it comes to Greenland. So first of all, China. How could we not talk about China? The rise of Chinese capabilities in the extreme polar climates and military modernization across the board has seen an uptick in Beijing's physical presence in a maritime sense in the Arctic. China has established research linkages in the higher education sector throughout Nordic states, and it has consistently sought to invest in critical infrastructure in Greenland, first with an airport, hospitals, now with schooling. Because those decisions need to be cleared by the Danes have come to the party and said no. So that's I guess a positive. The next other sort of strategic issue worth touching on is global resource insecurity. So international resource needs naturally push our markets north. But most seabed minerals and hydrocarbons are well within established EEZs. So the map there on the left is quite a useful one to show the Arctic Rim states and their prospective EEZs. If you put a CARA model, which is used by the US government to determine where there are expected deposits of resources, hydrocarbons, oil and gas in the seabed, it would fit quite nicely within these EEZs. So the idea that there's a free-for-all over the Arctic Ocean or the Arctic seabed is not the case. So not pictured here on this map, though, is the extended seabed continental Arctic Ocean claim that's sort of underway. So here you've got China, Russia, and Denmark, simply by way of Greenland. Yeah, and here. So the blue, the green, and the grey colour all have overlapping claims to the middle of the Arctic Ocean, the North Pole. To the seabed and the resources beneath it. Now, all 3 countries have been using international law. They've got various personnel working through the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which is part of the UN UNCLOS framework, and no one has, quote unquote, taken territory when it comes to the seabed. These are, it's an ongoing process of legal. It's a legal problem, first of all, but all that the UN Commission can actually do is accept or reject scientific evidence that the seabed and the resources are a continuation of a state's continental shelf. For now, the Russian evidence, which reaches right over the North Pole and takes a fair chunk of the Arctic Ocean seabed just because of the geography and the size of that state, that evidence has been accepted in full by the Commission. The Canadian evidence is under consideration still, and we expect once Denmark decides whether or not Greenland gets to have the resources in her waters, we'll have an outcome on that. But it could be decades away. And if you were following at Christmas time, actually, side point, the US made a unilateral claim to the Arctic Ocean seabed. So as it's not it hasn't ratified UNCLOS, it's signed it but hasn't ratified it. It means that it can't actually stake a claim to the extended continental shelf, but nonetheless, it has put in a claim to say this is ours. What's in the seabed's ours. And of interest to polar nerds like me was they probably could have extended the claim further north towards the North Pole, and they did not. They fall quite far closer towards the Beaufort Sea. So there's that. Now, Greenland itself is home to vast minerals beneath the ice sheet. We've heard this narrative. But with limited workforce capabilities and a lack of national investment in unlocking this wealth, Greenland has the potential, but it's not something that can be turned on overnight. To unlock this commercial sort of value proposition in Greenland, you'd need huge amounts of foreign investment. You'd need an entire ecosystem of men, women, but men to operate these mines. Then you've got to deal with the cost and the distance and the environment that's dark for most of the year to actually get the product securely to market. So it's a difficult one. And also with critical mineral mining, it's not just about the resources, and it's only one part of the equation. The refinery processes are the key problem, and they all hold and sit with China. Another area of strategic sort of interest when it comes to Greenland is just generally the revenge of geography. The basic stuff of strategic studies has come back. So the re-emergence of a Cold War submarine choke point through the North Atlantic is illustrated quite often in terms of a scramble for Greenland by the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. It's a Cold War maritime choke point. So that's a key issue. But also developments in missile technologies make Greenlandic airspace so vital to the forward defense of North America. Another area is this idea of the redrawing of international transport corridors. And I know that's boring. Shipping tends to be something we think is an afterthought, but the way in which the global arteries of transportation, trade, the lifeblood of our world, are essentially going to move away from us in Asia. It is going to move north. And that makes countries like Australia very expensive to supply, to service. South Korea, a month or so ago, has now legislated that they need to be working on a Northern Sea route or an Arctic route strategy for their economy. Singapore is also looking at how it can insert itself into Arctic sea trade routes. So that this is all complete. I can't highlight how much this is changing and so quickly. So if you've got your Arctic sea routes linking Asia to Europe, you're offering a 40% minimum reduction in distance compared to the traditional Suez Canal route. South Korea, India, China, and the UAE are international markets and states that have already signed on, whether it's in port infrastructure, in Supermax containers, to work with Russia in opening up the Arctic. Now, Beijing has gone a step further, of course, and has incorporated the Arctic into its Belt and Road initiative, dubbing it the Polar Silk Road. So, Greenland's position by the map is essentially one end of an Arctic corridor, and there's only another and that's US territory already. So it makes it a viable candidate for transshipment hub facilities to be built, but it also underscores the strategic leverage over the future of global trade that a state can have over Greenland. Alliance politics is another strategic issue to watch when it comes to Greenland. President Trump has ushered in a break with traditional American foreign policy, with the American First agenda, which is underpinned by this Dunro Doctrine. Washington has prioritized the Western Hemisphere for US national security. That's for them to do and to decide. It's not something that we, I guess, get a vote in. Greenland is geographically in the Western Hemisphere. It's indeed a North American landmass. So the European and Allied reaction to Washington's legitimate reprioritization of interests has underscored a level of immense over-reliance and free-riding that exists in Europe. Efforts in Brussels to shape the US Greenland strategy as somehow new or pervasive illustrate a clear disparity between the expectations, strategic reality, and assumptions of partnership in contemporary alliance politics under Donald Trump. Greenland's own agenda. This is a big one. So Indigenous rights are back and front of centre when it comes to the Greenlandic debate. While the pathway for independence was clarified and further supported in the 2009 Act in the Danish Constitution, you've got to read the fine print. So Denmark still holds the key. It has to approve the results of any referendum held. It is surely unlikely that Copenhagen would cut off a healthy leg, think of Greenland in terms of its resources, or the fact that it accounts for 95% of the kingdom by territory. Not to mention the fisheries and the reliance there economically now, or the fear that the Faroe Islands, it will trigger some kind of movement for them to also seek independence. So Greenlandic polls show there is a consistent majority for independence. The often touted poll in every, I've got PTSD from reading it, about Greenlandic people and their thoughts about joining the US, this poll, to which the majority voted no. Correct. However, it's a misleading framing of the question. Always look at the methodology of polling. It was posed as an either-or question, as follows. Do you wish to stay in Denmark or join America? Recent public statements indicate there is enduring unease between Greenlandic leaders and Denmark. And this is something I've watched really closely over the last 3 or 4 weeks. Notably, the references from all European states voicing their support for Danish sovereignty. Denmark is wedged by the re-emergent interest in Greenland because Danish society, millennials, right, support Greenlandic independence. The Danish political elite recognise the strategic loss on the table. And the Greenlandic people simply want their voice heard. Then there is the most recent events. NATO's Secretary General had the big meeting with Trump, and both left with a sense that tensions had been reduced. Trump started talking about a framework of a deal being agreed to. Denmark, Greenland, and the NATO Secretary General himself have all asked for further information. It seems no one is on the same page here, so we certainly haven't heard the last of Greenland. And if I've got a moment, can I close on some scenario work I've been doing? Yeah? Okay. So to the right-hand side, this is a living, breathing Liz map. It changes every week or so, but it has tended to be on the money. So in terms of scenarios for how I think Greenland might go, the highest scenario, where I think it is headed, is the top left, consume. Now, consume can happen in a fast way or a slow way. Let me talk about that one. So the US might support Greenlandic independence movements a lot more. They hold a referendum, they seek independence, but Denmark opts to block the outcome. They don't agree to it, they don't approve to it because of the idea that foreign influence somehow was involved. So, on the back of this, we may have a result in which the US steps in to defend the Greenlandic agency and absorbs Greenland just as it did in World War II. Occupies. Where I'm hoping things will go, and I think policy signals indicate this is happening, we could see a Compact of Free Association, so the COFA agreement, struck between Nuuk, capital of Greenland, and Washington. This would grant Greenland sovereignty, independence, and agency. Washington would essentially take the position of Denmark in terms of holding some kind of fiscal underwriting responsibility, looking after the defence and security of the island. But significantly, Greenland can exit a COFA. You can exit an agreement at your own prerogative. Next likely I had was clash, and yeah, I've put that down to low this week. It might change next week. Here we could see European powers and the US decouple entirely. Tensions can't come back from the brink. The rules-based order and the architecture of it are trashed beyond salvage. Tariff wars could proliferate, economic war could break out. The remaining pillars of the international community would be abolished. There'd be no real deterrence value left in NATO, for starters. Then we could see European militaries mount for battle against America in the Arctic over Greenland. Good luck. The other scenario I also place very low is cease. Unfortunately, cease. This would see the US abandoning the Greenlandic agenda. The Golden Dome strategy isn't a priority. Washington walks away from the idea of hemispheric defence. The US footprint at the Bidufik Space Base remains stable, but the status quo of the Greenland-Danish relationship endures. Imperfectly, but endures. The final scenario of seed, which I place in the medium category this week, so higher than cease, is that the centrality of Greenland to US strategy, whether it is this hemispheric defence notion, Golden Dome, it's scaled back slightly, and incremental steps are instead adopted. European powers manage to meet Washington halfway and deliver on upping their investment and capabilities and their commitments to the High North and the Arctic. And this morning you probably heard that NATO's now committed to running Arctic Sentry, which is going to be a High North Arctic alliance exercise. That's big news. Usually you have 3 others that run in the High North and the Arctic, but they're every second year. So this could be an annual one, right? A more robust transatlantic footprint is established on Greenland to counter foreign threats to the region. But none of that deals with that permeating issue at the surface, the permeating issue at the heart of the Greenland security story, and that is the Danish-Greenland relationship. Thank you. Questions?
Chat, Robbie. One of the fascinating presentation, very few people knew about, but the thing that really intrigues me is really the unknown is the Inuits and how they're going to be, because there's clearly a movement to get away from basically white rule.
Yes.
But not to go to another white rule, which that's what it would be. Is there a strong movement? I mean, there are only less than 60,000 people. It's a very inhospitable neighborhood. Do you even have infrastructure, to actually run the show by themselves? So is that potential problem? It's one of the things we don't talk very much about.
Yeah. And it's a nasty kind of thing to talk about. We're trying to argue that we are trying to support people, humans, from exiting a abhorrent history just to potentially walk into the arms of another master in many ways. And so it's something that in putting the book out and in delving into the subject, I felt like I had a duty to understand the Greenland perspective. So Can you hear me? No. So a number of my discussions have been with mums. I've spoken to parents I can press it. You can figure it out. I'm going to hold it down. Oh, sorry. It's talking to, mums like me who, no matter where you are in the world, you want better for your children's generation. So that is something I think that is a hook that the Greenlandic people are holding on to with what is on offer with the COFA agreement. So having their independence, being able to walk away if they're not happy with it, but also having opportunity for their children. So when you spoke about the infrastructure issues in Greenland, 100%, this is beyond a few major settlements, towns. You don't have roads linking the communities. True to the Inuit nature of these peoples, they are nomadic for the most part. So they move where the fishing is. They move where the hunting is. It's really interesting. But I understand what you're saying about, well, how can a solution for quote unquote freeing people and giving them human agency be another form of repression? Well, it comes down to the leaders that are currently in Greenland who run Greenland. They've got a coalition of parties. All of the major parties in Greenland, however small the parliament is, they all agree that it's just a case of not if they are free and independent, it is when. But in order to be free and independent, you need to have your economic security sorted out. You need a sustainable future, and the coercive ways in which the Danish sort of, the parliament has written the rule book for how they will leave. It's wild, and I encourage anyone to reach out and to read it. For one thing, as soon as the Danish people, so Greenlandic people, attract foreign direct investment into opening up, say, another mine somewhere. Say it is Canada, they're going to put $200 million US into Greenland. By that amount, the Danish block grant reduces. And it is framed as we need to get you to stand on your own 2 feet. But, that matters for a lot of people. So as a parent, I think looking and thinking through the lens of wanting higher education for their children, perhaps wanting free and fair movement to the US, you wouldn't need visas. The way that COFAs work are really interesting. It's such a messy issue, and
Fascinating.
It will endure.
I don't often hear about it, and it's it falls between the cracks completely. But I remember thinking about that. But what do they think about it?
Yeah.
Because they are the people living there. So,
well, this is the point that I raised when I was closing on my address, that what was so fascinating is talking with friends in Greenland about how awkward it was. And go back and watch the video. So you know how you had the Greenlandic Minister for Foreign Affairs go with the Danish leadership to the White House for that quick summit. And I think it was most people found it quite funny because they rushed outside and were chain smoking after the meeting. You know this one? Yeah, yeah. Um, Around that meeting, there was a few media on the spot interviews, and you could see, and talking with Greenlandic friends, you could see the discomfort in the representative of the Greenlandic people. The questions were not directed there. It was always through Denmark. And that's the same with the statements that have come out in support of Danish sovereignty. And that's not really what the Greenlandic people care for. So this is why the idea that independence is absolutely a priority. I think that the news media does beat up the fact that there might be a lot of opposition to Trump when it comes to Greenland. I don't think that's necessarily the case on the ground anymore.
I visited Queensland a couple of years ago, two small villages on the southwest coast, Nanatulik and Crocodile. You've probably heard of them. I didn't visit the capital. This is more an observation, not really a question, but I spoke to a young police officer there wearing Danish insignia.
Yep.
And an Inuit guy, local fella. I asked him whether he was able to go to Denmark proper and be a police officer. His answer was yes. So he can live in the European Union, he can be a police officer in Denmark. So that's one aspect of it. What I also noticed was quite a lot of poverty. You're right about the roads, there are cars, but the villages aren't linked by road. Yep. It is rugged, really rugged place. It's iced in for 9 months of the year. It's a pretty tough environment. But the poverty there was extreme. They live on Danish subsidies. And what I didn't see at all was a Danish flag. I saw a number of Greenlandic flags, not one Danish flag. Just an observation. So it's a bit of a limbo sort of place at the moment.
Yeah.
I did see a documentary about a proposed Inuit homeland between Canada, Russia, and places like Greenland. Iceland's a whole different demographic, but those northern Nordic type Sama people, Sami. But again, under all the KPIs for development, for education, for any sort of prosperity, there's no way they can make an economic go of it. They need external help. So no matter what you talk about dressing up independence, they need external help.
Any question? Yeah, yeah, Richard.
Just related to that, to the economics of Greenland. I heard brief references that the White House had spoken about making a purchase as part of its offer. Did it ever get serious about that and really try to generate a number and go to Denmark/Greenland?
Could neither confirm or deny. In November 2025, the one library, public library in Nuuk, threw its doors open, and in the middle was an entire conference table set up with U.S. Embassy Greenland branding, and there were books about the US and what life's like in the US. So I make that point because the discussions that we hear, Trump might cut a check for every Greenlandic person. They'd be crazy not to consider it. Could it actually happen? Absolutely. There is a influence operation at some level, a cultural one, to share what I think very realistically could be an offer, a monetary offer. As I mentioned when I briefly began, Trump Jr., Don Jr., is in and out of Greenland. Peter Thiel from PayPal is in and out of Greenland. All of the tech guys are in and out of Greenland because, with the uptick in AI, you need, this guy's nodding because I think he knows where I'm going with this, yeah. You need massive amounts of vast, unpopulated, cold land to set up server farms. So you can run processing, and so I think the business interests in Washington, yes, they are private, not necessarily state, will lead the US government. Industry will leave government to some sort of deal with Greenland, for sure. Yeah, yeah. And just really quickly, I just really wanted to say something about did you go on a cruise ship? Like, was it a tourist, visit? What's really interesting about that is that in order to have external help, it can't just be it has to be sustainable. So it can't just be investment in mines or in the space to run server farms or for setting up ground receiving stations for any of the countries that want to lock up, your atmosphere, because it's limited thermal interference because there's not a huge population. So you have a very clear shot to space. So these are the parts of the world that are going to be prime real estate, right? But tourism is another aspect that could potentially provide an economic, lifeline for the Greenlandic people. They could learn how to, but it isn't, but it is something that with foreign investment, whether it's from the Americans, from the French, whoever, to invest in these other opportunities for diversifying their economy. It can't just be resources. It has to be things like that. And with what China is doing in the number of, icebreaker tourism offerings it has, and the uptick in Chinese nationals wanting to go into the Arctic and spend time there could be investment from China as well in hotels, in landing. There has to be other opportunities. But I do take your point that there has to be some kind of injection and help there. The alcoholism, something you didn't mention, but that's a huge, didn't mention that. Alcoholism and drug use is awful. 83% of students do not finish higher education. They leave, arguably because the examinations are still in Danish. They don't speak Danish.
I didn't see any difference between signatures. It was all either in English or in local language.
Let's move on.
We could go forever.
You think so?
Yep.
Quickly, so it doesn't look like you don't think US is going to take it over by force, which seemed to be a threat for a while. Secondly, there's money flowing into the oligarchies and the Trump empire. Trump is that.
It might not be by force, but force isn't the only lever of influence. It's the geoeconomic game now. Yes.
The environmental implication of fossil fuel deposits are pretty big there, are they?
Yes.
Yeah. And finally, have you any sense of what the Australian government is thinking about this, or not really in their radar yet?
I'm surprised you all turned up. There's so much fun going on in Canberra at the moment. For the Australian government, the polar link I would have hoped was the broad brush strategic shifts and the statecraft and the resource insecurity and the new technologies and the geoeconomic game that's happening in the Arctic is well underway in the Arctic, is well underway in the Antarctic, for which absolutely, yeah, apples and oranges, but the overall sort of frameworks I see applying there as well. Same players, same issues. They are. Yes, that's my next book. Thank you. Thank you. Guy at the back.
Yep.
Back?
In the back here. Yeah.
Greenland is covered by NATO through Denmark.
Yes, it's just not in the EU. Yes. Yes. I will, yeah. Mhm.
So Canada, US, or the totally independent.
Is there a movement to associate with Canada?
Not yet. Now there might be. You've given he's speaking tomorrow, right, at the Munich Security Conference. He'll have another here. Oh, interesting. Oh, okay. Yes, so interestingly enough, Denmark hasn't paid as much in GDP terms towards the alliance in recent years because it has pointed to the sort of free rent, essentially, that the alliance has had through accessing what is hosted at the Bidufik space base. In terms of what that does for strategic warning down into the North Atlantic for Europe. Canada had always been, when you have a look at the map that had all of the Arctic Rim states, Canada had always been very, very wary of pushing for a NATO footprint in the Arctic. And that's why they used to always talk about the High North. So the High North is an easier way to frame it as a political area, a domain, as opposed to the Arctic, which is a strategic geographical domain. And that's over 50% legitimately, thank you, over 50% legitimately Russian territory. So it was just easier for everyone if we just said it was the High North and we might do some search and rescue exercises there, snap exercises. That's all changed. What was the other? Oh, the EU point is really interesting. So Greenland was actually the first region, country, technically country, to exit the EU over fishery issues, right? So it is covered in an external territory sense by way of Denmark, though. And the fisheries around Greenland's EEZ, they account for 90% of the Danish sort of economic export imports scenario at the moment. So they need Greenland. Mm. Yeah. And so the way that the Danish Parliament dealt with that is really interesting. You should have a quick read of it. In the 2009 self-government Greenland Self-Government Act was essentially, yes, that exists and that's your right. We're just going to put an administrative framework around how you access that. And so the checks and balances that have been put in place, it for me as a researcher, when I was working through the story, it was just another mechanism of coercive control. And then you'd have the Danish government not approve the referendum result. It's a self-licking ice cream.
Caroline, question.
Well, look, just really more of a comment. First of all, thank you very much, Liz. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
I know a lot more now than I did before.
Oh, that's
I want to commend you on this book. And just to let people know, I was in Cambridge. I mentioned to you, I was in Cambridge last week, and your book was very prominently displayed in the main book area of impressive new books in one of the main bookshops in Cambridge. So yeah. Well done. I wish I'd bought a copy because if I'd known they were all going to be sold out here. I was also just wanted to pick up on the NATO point, which I think is really interesting because I was also in Brussels with an ANU group, and we had a lot of discussions with NATO colleagues who were, I think, in the sense of shock coming out of the immediate crisis, but really feeling this great sense of trepidation about what might happen next. Yeah. So they felt there'd been some reprieve, but with no certainty about where it would go from there. And there was also, quite interestingly, some mixed reactions around NATO to the very strong call by the Danish Prime Minister to say that it would be the end of NATO were the Americans, a NATO ally, to invade another NATO ally, which seems to be a self-evident point. But it was quite controversial because of the assistance that many NATO allies want to get from the Americans, and they were concerned at how this might play. But in fact, I think quite interestingly, given the tensions within NATO and with the Americans, it seemed to shore up a section of Republican support for NATO, because some Republicans in Congress in particular were so alarmed at the idea that this could presage real crisis in NATO. So it doesn't make that.
Yeah, I think it speaks to this sense that, I mean, groupthink, we think it's bad in Canberra. You know, imagine it in the halls of whatever part of politics you're in the US. But the idea that the European nations were quote unquote free riding in a military strategic sense, I think for a lot of people, allowed them to sort of assume that there was no real heart or interest or love for the US. And that wasn't the case. And so that's where I think that kind of knee-jerk reaction of, oh gosh, they actually mind that we are destabilizing this. Let's rectify that. I had thought that, you know, Denmark might be the offering to keep NATO together. They might just sacrifice her wishes. And so that's what I did originally kind of think. But then at the same time, you've got, you know, she says these statements about the affront of it, and yet the day before they'd just signed another foreign military sale request for their entire air-to-air defense missile system to come from the US, of which F-35s as well are currently arriving. So the entire kit, not only of Europe, but also of Denmark, is American. They're wedged.
One more question.
Thank you.
Actually, very important. I don't pick up that anyone's thinking of the think tanks, but there's nothing in the press. But you know, this is the sort of thing that could lead back 3 years' time.
Yeah.
And dominate out there.
So some of the archival stuff I've done now for the book on Antarctica, it's How to Lose a Continent. It is fascinating because the way in which, you know, Menzies era government was negotiating the treaty, the Antarctic Treaty in 59 and then inked in 61, it was never conceived to be a set and forget solution to Antarctica. It was what can we do to set aside the issue of sovereignty and overlapping claims and let's work together in the Cold War era for peace and science, but we'll return to that issue. So the idea that the Australian government has, for decades now, assumed that there's a treaty looking after things is simply not the case. It's not the way the treaty is written and how it functions in every sense of the word. One point I will make, because I'll go on forever about the comparison, but the way in which this Chinese strategic narrative has changed at both ends of the earth is fascinating. So in 2018, China published a Arctic policy paper. Now, it is just it was just an observer to the Arctic Council, which is a very, very weak attempt at governance. They can't talk about military security affairs, but they were just an observer to that. So it was a bit of a wake-up call for this state, quite a far way away from the Arctic, to call itself a near Arctic power in a Chinese state Arctic policy. That was a bit interesting. What's happened in the last 2 years, though, China has dropped all reference to being a near Arctic power. It now calls itself a great polar power. The rebranding internally is everywhere. And I think there's a very obvious other pole. Technically, there's 3 poles. The Himalayas do count, and we've got issues there as well. So from every kind of vector, whether it's strategic competition, the resource insecurity, or a changing climate, which is opening up some of these real estate, you know, global potential, they do not neatly exactly fit. There are different governance frameworks. There's different, you know, one's a continent, the other's a littoral area. But there needs to be so much more national discussion about our 42% sovereign claim to Antarctica. They don't, and they base their major research station and flag at the geographical South Pole. So that says everything.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to stop it here.
Come back for Antarctica.
Okay. It was fascinating, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Really great stuff. We could be here another hour, but that's not going to happen. But it was really lots of fun. So please, everyone, join me too.
Thank you.